Hey everyone, I'm Perrin Anto. I'm a UX designer on Android accessibility, leading our assistive tech efforts for deaf, hard of hearing, and speech disabilities across Android, Pixel, and Google Research. I've also had a lot of experience jamming on web accessibility and workspace and cloud, everything from features to compliance at scale. I also care deeply about this space. I myself am on the autism spectrum, and I've had various family members affected by disabilities. And I'm also excited about the entrepreneurship space. My background is originally in computer science at Columbia. I was a design teaching fellow there, where I taught Columbia entrepreneurship, teaching about the value of design thinking to startups and new ventures. So I am really excited to bring kind of the accessibility and the venture side all together today to chat about building for everyone through accessibility. So what's on the agenda today? We're going to talk about why we need to focus on accessibility. We'll walk through some common accessibility mistakes and things to look out for. And then lastly, we're going to look at some really cool tools, resources to make sure you're well supported. So yeah, we'll start off with why we need accessibility. So let's zoom out and talk about what is accessibility. We often focus on these different types of disability groups when talking about persons with disabilities. So we look at visual, like someone who may be blind, motor, someone in a wheelchair, oral, so someone who's deaf or has a speech impairment, as well as cognitive, someone who may have ADHD. And so all of these examples that come to mind when we start talking about disabilities are really permanent disabilities, and it's a wider spectrum than that. So here we can see the permanent disability, like being in a wheelchair that I was talking about, but we can also have temporary disabilities. So think about my childhood when I broke both my arms playing Taekwondo. In that moment, you may have a motor impairment for a temporary amount of time. As well as situational, trying to cook some yummy pasta, you're not going to have access to your arms to have an interaction. And so all of these people have different relationships to abilities. And you may be asking, what do all these people have in common? Well, they have an ability match. So for example, voice control and voice texting is going to be a better match for them in this current moment to maybe respond to a text from their friends or using Assistant to control something on their phone. And so we like to think about that wider spectrum when it comes to disabilities and really move a little bit away from just thinking about disability as a personal health condition, but us as people who build products look at disability as something context dependent. So rather than seeing someone in a wheelchair and seeing stairs and saying, oh, that's because of their disability, seeing the stairs as a mismatched human interaction. And so with that context, we can really focus more on access, the access depending on somebody's abilities. And so on the right, you can see different types of permanent, temporary, situational disabilities based on different senses. And by thinking about this full spectrum, it includes kind of a better way to do product development just for people, not just for people with disabilities, but also for everyone. And so that's reason number one why we care about this is when you build with accessibility, you benefit everyone. So I'm based out of New York City. I took the subway ride this morning. I wanted to watch a video, but I didn't have my headphones. All good. The YouTube video I had captions. And so something built for someone who's deaf was also useful for me in this situation. Also, train ride super bumpy. I'm trying to make a bank transfer. Luckily enough, banks are required to have accessibility. So the buttons were pretty big, so I didn't make a mistake doing any of my banking. And so here you can see how accessibility is helping everyone. Also, when I got out of the subway, it was super sunny. It's a wonderful day here. And having lots of contrast, having good contrast on the screen was a big aspect of being able to discern buttons, even with heavy screen glare. So even though accessibility improvements help everyone, we still have big commitments to people with disabilities. In the US, throughout the 90s, we had a lot of laws passed. The ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a civil law. Section 508, which is a federal law. And then we also have WCAG, which is a set of global accessibility guidelines that was also started in the 90s to help users, help different organizations apply accessibility. Also internationally, a lot more countries are adopting accessibility and disability policies to hold up those WCAG standards. So we still have a legal requirement. Even looking at large institutions like Google, we evaluate when deciding to use a vendor for something, whether or not their product is accessible before making that purchasing decision. In the US, if you're doing something in the public sector, if you're offering a product to maybe a school, government agency, something funded by the government, you're also going to be required to uphold these standards. So reason number two, building with accessibility not only opens you up to more customers, but also prevents any lawsuits. Because they have these protections by law, you can't prohibit people with disabilities from using your products. Also, bonus reason, we have experienced this occasionally where going back and trying to fix something that has been implemented inaccessibly takes way more engineering work, development work, design work than just doing it accessibly from the start. And then, if we zoom out and we look at also the number of people with disabilities, people are really surprised that World Health Organization estimates about 1 billion people are living with disabilities, and this would make them the largest minority within the whole world. And so with that being such a large minority, it also creates a really large market. So it's estimated just within the US that people with disabilities have about $175 billion in discretionary spending. So that makes this a really big market, larger than others like tweens or teenagers that we often target with products. And so reason number three is with about $1 trillion globally in disposable income from people with disabilities, this creates not only the largest global minority, but a huge market opportunity, estimated to be larger than China plus EU combined. So caring about people with disabilities not only is a good thing from the heart, but also a great thing for your products and making sure everyone can use them. So I have a list of some common mistakes to look out for. These are kind of some easy wins that you can do to start early baking accessibility into your products. So here you can see an example from Gmail, and we have a button with a little paperclip. And if you're using a screen reader, you need to make sure to have an accessibility label. That way, when the screen reader comes across this button, it can tell the user, what is that paperclip thing? And so here you can see an example of accessibility label attach file. We like to use action verbs. We like to be very concise with these. The screen reader does add extra content that this is a button. So you don't need to say, hey, this is a attach file button. So you don't have to talk about the role or the state of things when adding accessibility labels. Whatever assistive text someone is using will add that. Here's some more examples. If you're coming into Google Photos and you want to create album and we're adding an accessibility label, we can keep it very succinct and simple with create album. We don't have to say create new album, create album button. We don't want to be redundant. So that's something we hear a lot from people who use assistive tech is if you're using accessibility labels, try to be succinct. The one moment where you can get a little bit creative is with images. So here you can see we have a space satellite that's crashed in Michigan. You can go in and say, this is mangled, it's a satellite, it's about a car size, it's on the ground. People do appreciate when you put that descriptive aspect into images, though. So beyond just labeling things, also making sure on the color side that we have enough color contrast. You can pick up any color contrast pickers on the internet, just Google color contrast checker, and they will tell you these things called contrast ratios. And all that you need to remember is if you have something smaller, like smaller text, to have 4.5 to 1 contrast ratio. And so you can check that in the checker. And if you have a larger either icon or text, then you may be able to drop it to 3 to 1 color contrast. You can look back on some guidelines later that I'll link at the end. But making sure that we have sufficient contrast is really important for the readability, not only for someone who may have some vision impairments, who may struggle to read things that are low contrast, but again, like myself walking out of the subway this morning, or it's super dark at night and you're trying to read something and you're squinting your eyes. So color contrast helps with everyone's readability. Also, the larger touch targets that we talked about earlier. So making sure any sort of interactive elements on your page within whatever app or product that you're building are, we suggest 48 by 48 pixels as a minimum, but the WCAG, the international guidance, requires 44 by 44 as the minimum. Based on our research, this is a good enough size of a button for people to reliably hit it, even for someone with no tremors or no motor impairments. If you go smaller than 48, it can be pretty difficult to accurately tap it, and we see a lot more instances of people mistapping which button they want. And then next up is when you're building out your content on the engineering side, to make sure the way that you group the different content within your app. So on the right, you can see different standings for sports. And if the way you build it is you group the content by each single column and row, you have to be careful that when a screen reader or assistive tech device comes across it, that it's not just going to read Boston, Philadelphia, Atlanta, and then not tell you the relevant stats for that team. And so you can easily test this out by opening up TalkBack or VoiceOver on mobile, or the built-in screen readers on desktop, going to your app and just swiping through and seeing, does this read out content? Does the flow and the way that it reads that content out feel natural? And we have some more resources and videos on how to do this on the engineering side that we link to. And then lastly, near and dear to my heart as someone who works on captioning products, if you have any sort of media within your app, within your product, within your website, to make sure to at least use a platform that can add captions to that video. We often see videos that are beautiful, splashy for marketing, but unfortunately, someone who's deaf, hard of hearing, or on the subway and doesn't have their headphones can't enjoy that content that you've created on the fly. So really, if you're doing any sort of video or audio content within your products, make sure that captions are available for that. Cool. So those are my quick tips. And to end it out, I have some awesome tools and resources that us Googlers have put together. We have an accessibility scanner. Pretty much what it does is it goes through an app. It's something you can download on Google Play, and it checks for bad accessibility moments where the accessibility that you've done is not compliant with requirements from that WCAG that I was talking about earlier. And so I highly suggest downloading this because it will help identify a lot of the things I just talked about. There's also an open source version for iOS. Our amazing developer relations team for Android has built out bite-sized videos specifically for accessibility on Android and how to develop for that. So you can just Google on YouTube even accessibility on Android and you'll find their playlist. And then lastly, the team has written pretty robust developer docs on the Android developers site that will go into more details. Also highly suggest this because they cross-link other resources from Google Accessibility, like our material design accessibility guidelines. So thank you so much for joining and taking the first step in making the world more accessible.